The following video is a direct continuation of two previous videos, Populate or Perish and Far From Home, both of which can be found in the History of Elizabeth playlist, found on this channel's homepage.
Weapons Research Establishment headquarters at Salisbury is in the open country 16 miles from Adelaide, capital of South Australia. The whole area is 7 square miles inside a security fence. Where so much work is secret, all movement into the site must be by security pass. By agreement between the governments of the United Kingdom and Australia, the establishment was created to provide a 1,250-mile land range for testing guided weapons developed by United Kingdom manufacturers. The Missile Project Group is the link between the establishment and the British contractors carrying out trials. A complete section of buildings has been set aside for the contractors. Here they receive the missiles from England, carry out assembly, final tests and modifications, and prepare the internal instrumentation for the firing on the Woomera range.
As the new town of Elizabeth grew, its impact on the surrounding older townships of Smithfield and Salisbury was both immediate and dramatic. The development of Elizabeth is the largest and most publicised project ever undertaken by the Trust in its history. It involved planning and building the state's second largest city from scratch on a rural site. It also stands as a symbol of the optimism and achievements of the Playford era in the expansion of South Australia's population and industry. Situated 27 kilometres north of Adelaide between the small country settlements of Salisbury and Smithfield, Elizabeth inevitably also affected their development and contributed to the urban transformation of the surrounding hills and plains. Yet most studies, and certainly most Housing Trust publications, focus upon Elizabeth itself as a distinct town, independent of the older nearby towns of Smithfield or Salisbury, or the newer surrounding suburbs. Certainly, Elizabeth was a spectacular achievement. Apart from the national capital, Canberra, in the 20th century, this was the first large town in Australia planned and brought into existence upon open country. As had been the case with older trust developments, most new developments in Australia was then tacked on to older settlements. Still, in a broader sense, Elizabeth was also a tacked-on development. Firstly, it was created in close proximity to Salisbury, although the two towns were not in the slightest integrated in the Trust's physical planning. Elizabeth's early dependence on the established community rapidly changed to conflict, not only in civic affairs but in terms of physical development. The pride, problems and the traditions of the old township of Salisbury were ignored by the planners. This led to, or at least exacerbated, the running battle between Salisbury and Elizabeth's interests within the district and its council. In their intoxication with the modern new town, the Trust planners overlooked the historic and aesthetic qualities of the old township. Salisbury formed Elizabeth's southern boundary. Elizabeth's northern boundary was the southern boundary of the old Smithfield township within the Woomera District Council. By the mid-1960s, the Trust had purchased 2,600 acres in Woomera, which were later developed as an expansion of Smithfield and not as part of Elizabeth. The first developments there were named Elizabeth West in 1961, Elizabeth Field in 1963, followed by expansion northwards into Smithfield Plains and Woomera from 1965. The second tacked-on characteristic of Elizabeth was that it was planned as a satellite town to Adelaide proper. Trust planners were at first less optimistic than they became about the town's independence of the city's industrial employment. The original concept envisioned that most residents would be employed at industries on the northern side of Adelaide within 15 to 30 minutes travelling time. One of Elizabeth's planners, Trust architect Henry Smith, also pointed out that there was, from the start, little doubt that Elizabeth would be engulfed in the northwards expansion of Adelaide and become a suburb, saying this thought has in fact influenced its planning, and our aim is that it will retain its identity when it eventually becomes part of the Adelaide metropolis. As he set about creating Elizabeth, he studied English model towns and travelled to conferences to keep up to date with current planning concepts. Working closely with engineers, landscape designers, architects, economists, doctors, social scientists, and valuers, he combined their input to produce the final concept where the needs of the community and pedestrians were paramount. The design of Elizabeth was ahead of its time, with open areas for community parks and ovals close to all the homes. It was standard practice to have 12% as open space, but Elizabeth managed 25%. And by 1970, she was known as the Garden City. Other aspects of Elizabeth's planning took into account the likelihood of adjacent private subdivision. For example, the Elizabeth Town Centre was intended both as a focus for Elizabeth and as a regional centre. The very generous provision of open space was in part a deliberate over-provision in order to try and create a balance between later subdivisions abutting on private land, subdivisions that was expected to provide no more than 5% of open space. This over-provision of open space was a deliberate attempt by Henry Smith to ensure that once Elizabeth was surrounded by new suburbs and townships, that it would itself retain its unique character. An attempt that would come under threat 40 years later when the Elizabeth City and Manapara City Councils amalgamated and became Playford. Both before and after Elizabeth, the Trust itself engaged in adjacent housing and industrial development. Their greatest coup, the establishment of the huge General Motors Holden's plant at Elizabeth South, was on land that was originally intended as a greenbelt between Salisbury and Elizabeth. Even earlier than that, the Trust began with exactly the type of tacked-on development frequently criticised in Australia. And while Elizabeth is often given credit as the beginning of northern urban development, the Salisbury North estate is the proper place to begin this account. Not only was it the Trust's first development in the area, but many people have claimed with some justification that the Trust learned by its mistakes at Salisbury North, mistakes which it took care not to repeat at Elizabeth. Salisbury's transformation from a quiet town centre surrounded by hayfields and orange groves started with the construction of a large wartime munitions factory at Penfield, north of Salisbury, in 1940. This was followed by the erection of nearly 300 cabin homes at Salisbury to house the munitions workers. There was some local agitation at the time for trust housing too, but the Trust was not swayed. Continued local pressure after the war and the expectation that employment in the area was likely to increase persuaded the Trust to include Salisbury in its country program. 20 pairs of rental houses were originally planned, but as in other country centres such as Port Augusta and Whyalla, sudden industrial expansion produced an equally rapid addition to the Trust's program. In 1947, a joint United Kingdom-Australia project was set up to build a testing range for rocket-propelled weapons at Woomera, with the former munitions factory at Penfield converted for use as a laboratory and production area. The long-range weapons establishment, later the Weapons Research Establishment, provided permanent and large employment, which was the type favoured by the Trust in its employment-related housing programs. In 1949, a large estate was proposed to be built on Trust land north of the Little Parra River to serve the needs of the weapons establishment. Between 1950 and 1955, Housing Trust contractors completed 1,080 double units at Salisbury North. Preference in allocation, up to 75% of the houses, was given to the employees of the weapons establishment and to associated firms such as Ferry Aviation. As a result, many of the residents of the estate were British, but as many were on contract, they later returned to Britain or were transferred elsewhere. Thus, the population at Salisbury North differed greatly from Salisbury residents in general. In 1954, 39% of the residents were British born, and in 1961, 31%. Turnover of tenants was as much as 10% per annum. The social differences were accentuated by the physical contrast between the established private residential area and the unfinished roads and the uniform appearance of the houses in the new estate. Apart from a few imported single units, all the houses were the usual red brick or Mount Gambier stone semi-detached pairs. Minor variations in plan or external treatment did little to reduce the overall monotony. The lack of sales houses also contributed to both physical and social uniformity. The Trust made only limited efforts to help with drainage and road making and to provide shopping or other community facilities. This was despite a survey by its own architects in 1959, which showed that the existing civic, commercial, educational and medical facilities of Salisbury were insufficient to meet the requirements of either the present or the proposed populations. Their report emphasised the need to expand services to meet the influx of residents to the new estate. For 500 new houses, at least 6 shops and about 20 acres of land for civic and recreational purposes should be provided. The Salisbury District Council lacked the finance and the expertise to provide the new services. When Mr. Jack Borman became District Clerk in 1952, there were about 80 trust homes completed, as he recalled, without roads or services of any kind. There was no planning by council, which was completely ignorant of the likely effects of the development or of the Trust's intentions. For its part, the Trust had no intention of acting on its own architect's advice, let alone solving all the problems faced by either the Salisbury Council or the residents themselves. In the early years, with no public transport, Salisbury North residents had to travel by foot or car to Salisbury for all their shopping needs. The first local group of 4 shops was not built by the Trust until 1952. By then, the population of the estate was 2,900, which was greater than Salisbury proper. A larger group of Trust shops with surgeries, bank and rent collection offices was officially provided for in 1955. Travel of any kind in winter was hazardous, because neither the roads nor the footpaths were sealed. The Progress Association was formed in 1951 and made numerous complaints on this issue, but until the Town Planning Act was changed in 1955, the Trust was not legally required to make or seal roads, and the Council simply could not. Sealing started about that time, just as trenching for sewerage began. Until 1953, residents had been required to bury their sewerage in their backyards. Mr. Ray and Mr. Mavis Pinniger were well placed to make comparisons between Salisbury North and Elizabeth, and for that matter, Woodville Gardens, as they were Trust tenants at Woodville Gardens in the 1940s, the first official tenants at Elizabeth in the 1950s, then moved to private accommodation at Salisbury, returning as tenants in 1980. In common with other critics, their criticisms of Salisbury North were firstly of the lack of planning and facilities compared with those at Elizabeth, and secondly, of the consequences of the Trust establishing an entirely rental estate and then later appearing to populate it with people in difficulties, especially deserted wives. For similar reasons, the Council expressed opposition to double-unit rental housing and asked the Trust to concentrate more on single-unit developments. In 1962, the Council informed the Trust that it would refuse to grant approval for any further double units, claiming that such areas lacked civic pride, suffered in appearance and character, nearly violated minimum space bylaws, and devalued private homes in adjacent areas. Although most houses were allocated to the weapons establishment employees during the 1950s, there is some evidence to support the view that deserted wives and widows were later siphoned into Salisbury North. There was an increase in their numbers from about 1959. By 1966, the numbers of divorced and separated women at Salisbury North exceeded the state average, while the number at Elizabeth was less than average. This also supports the local view that there was some bias, at least at the level of selection by individual trust officers, towards allocating people considered better tenants to Elizabeth. and Salisbury North was soon seen as Elizabeth's poor relation, though in truth, the Trust's activities at Salisbury were not much different from the creation of its inner metropolitan rental estates. In both cases, the Trust's powers were limited largely to the construction of houses. Labour and building supplies were short, and demand was keen. The difference was that Salisbury North was so close in time and place to Elizabeth that comparisons were inevitable. The developments were only a few miles apart, initially situated within the same council area, and established at nearly the same time. Land was bought for the new town in 1950, construction started there in 1954, and after a break at Salisbury while this occurred, construction was resumed in Salisbury in 1958. The contrast between the two developments was stark. Much of it stemmed from the special planning and the special powers the Trust assumed to make Elizabeth a success. The Trust was allowed to use its own discretion in broadly interpreting its functions, for instance in providing much more than housing for the new town. Later, the relevant acts were altered to make those wider powers legitimate. These wider powers would allow the Trust in Elizabeth to not only build houses, but roads, civic and recreational centres, shopping centres, parks, and even factories. The planning of Elizabeth represented a dramatic change in Trust policy, which can be explained in part by public criticism of its previous large-scale developments such as Salisbury North. The new town should have a variety of building styles, sales houses for greater social mix, a sprinkling of blocks for private sale, and many of the community services that Salisbury lacked. Overall, the Trust was committed to act as a town planning and development authority at Elizabeth, rather than simply as a housing authority as it had at Salisbury North. To that end, despite the impact Elizabeth was certain to have upon Salisbury, and the contrast in the treatment of its developments at Salisbury North and the new town, the Trust's whole approach to Elizabeth was to treat it as an unrelated project on an untouched site.